It says, there's a quote, Rome was constantly filled. Buddy from Chicago asked me how the weather is here. A lot better than it is there. Let's see. Rome was, quote, constantly filled with the noise of buildings collapsing or being torn down to prevent it. And the tenants lived in constant expectation of its coming down on their heads. They collapsed for two reasons. One was they were too lightly built. And two, because the less desirable floors were the upper floors. Of course, there's no elevators. So if you've got to go up 6 stories, you know, who's going to live up there? The poor. Well, the poor are going to bring more people with them. So the weight of many people living on top, given the light construction underneath, down it comes. Jack, you can tell us about that. So not only were the buildings squeezed together, the people were crowded into tiny cubicles. Private houses were rare. In Rome, there was only one private house for every 26 blocks of apartments. Tenements lacked both furnaces and fireplaces. The cooking was also the only source of heat. Everyone lacked chimneys, still many centuries before they were invented. The rooms were always smoky. The only way windows could be closed was by hanging cloths or skins. They were drafty, prevent asphyxiation, and then the drafts, though, also increased fires that spread very rapidly. So given these living conditions, people tended to live their lives in public places, and the home of the average person must have served only as a place to sleep and to store possessions. Not a place you want to spend much time. You're not going to kick back and relax when you go home.
No lazy boys.
No lazy boys. No. Now, if you figure you got streets that are about 9.5 feet wide, and you've got 6-story buildings on both sides, let's talk about sanitation. Soap had not yet been invented. Water had to be carried in jugs from public fountains. There could have been little water for scrubbing floors or washing clothes, nor could there have been much for bathing. Although many people could go to the public baths. But even at the baths, the water was quite contaminated, because whether it came to a city by way of an aqueduct or from local wells, all of the larger cities had to store water in cisterns awaiting use, and untreated water, when left stagnant, encouraged the growth of algae and other organisms. So after a while, that water is undrinkable. One other thing is certain: when human density is high, urgent problems of sanitation arise. Granted that an underground sewer carried water from the major baths of Rome through public latrines next door and on out of the city to be dumped untreated into the Tiber River, which could therefore be smelled for many miles. But few people jogged off to public latrines each time nature called. Like all cities until very modern times, people used chamber pots and pit latrines, and for lack of open spaces, most Greco-Roman cities were entirely dependent on pots. Of course, pots need to be emptied, and often the only option was to dump them in the open ditches running down the streets that served as sewers. Too often, pots were emptied out of upper-story windows at night. Carry an umbrella. Yeah. Now you know why they invented it. We thought it was rain. Given limited water, means of sanitation, the incredible density of humans and animals. Narrow as they were, the streets were constantly traversed by horses, donkeys, and oxen, as well as by flocks on their way to be butchered, all making their own contributions to the mess. It must have been a remarkably filthy existence. The tenement cubicles were smoky, dark, often damp, always dirty. The smell of sweat, urine, feces, and decay permeated everything. Outside, mud, open sewers, manure, and crowds. In fact, human corpses, adult as well as newborns, were sometimes just pushed into an open sewer. And even if the wealthiest households could provide ample space and personal cleanliness, the rich could not prevent the stench of general filth from penetrating their homes. No wonder everyone was so fond of incense.
Garlic.
Yeah, kind of like that. Where she had flies, mosquitoes, and other insects flourish, and so on. And so this was very democratic because the stink and the flies and the insects went everywhere. Yeah. Then you've got crime. They were constantly crime-ridden, especially to newcomers in the cities. They were very, oftentimes people would flock to the cities hoping that it would be better. And so there were many criminals besides pickpockets, thieves, muggers. That's what most of them were. But they also had professional murderers for hire and the like. But, so you had constant riots, you had political uprisings, people are dissatisfied, so the Romans are always trying to put down these political things. So that's kind of those living conditions.
What was the life expectancy rate?
I don't know, I guess 40,
Yeah.
something like that.
Heat too.
Pardon me?
Don't forget the heat too.
And then you got the heat and summer, you bet. Yeah. So that was kind of the existence. So when you picture Paul going to Thessalonica, and you kind of take your tour, and you go through the city, and you see beautiful homes on the hills, and all these beautiful colors. Maybe not so much. Not then. All right. And then we want to get to what Gene talked about. People had constant diseases. They were more likely to die in the summer because in the wintertime the cold kind of mitigated some of the viruses and things, kind of kept them down. But illness and physical afflictions were dominant features of daily life. A recent analysis of human remains in ancient Jerusalem, in an ancient Jerusalem cesspool, found an abundance of tapeworm and whitworm eggs, indicating that almost everyone had them. See, nobody felt good. Everybody had something wrong with them. Although being infected of these is not fatal, both can cause anemia and make victims more vulnerable to other illnesses, lack of medications. The majority of persons living in these cities must have suffered from chronic health problems that caused them pain and some degree of disability, and of which many would soon die. Compared with modern cities, sickness was highly visible. Swollen eyes, skin rashes, lost limbs are mentioned over and over again in the sources as part of the urban scene. Now, one of the things they did back in the days before they had photography and fingerprinting, that if you had a contract of some sort and they had to identify you, they identified you by you, what you look like, anything that separated you out. And they noticed that in a 4th century papyrus that lists the number of persons owing debts, all of them were scarred. All of them were identified by scars. So they relied upon their distinctive disfigurements, is how they identified people. This is a brutal time to live. So they may have thought of these as the good old days, but I don't really want to go back there. Now, in the midst of all this, so you've got misery, illness, you've got anonymity because you don't have community in these big cities. You're just trying to somehow make life work. You've really got no communities to speak of. What Christianity, he says, provided was an island of mercy and security. Foremost was the Christian duty to alleviate want and suffering. And it started with Jesus. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. Stranger, you welcomed me, and so on, Matthew 25. And then in James 2, we see that the early church had the same idea. If a brother or sister is ill-clad in lack of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what does it profit? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. So the Christian point of view is we are responsible. They took that seriously back then. We are responsible for providing for those who don't have enough. All right? Now here's the pagan world, he said, especially among the philosophers. Mercy was regarded as a character defect. and pity as a pathological emotion. Because mercy involves providing unearned help or relief, it is contrary to justice. That's the pagan point of view. Classical philosophers taught that mercy indeed is not governed by reason at all, and humans must learn to curb the impulse. The cry of the undeserving for mercy must go unanswered. He continues, pity was a defect of character unworthy of the wise and excusable only in those who have not yet grown up. So that's how the pagan world in that time viewed any acts of mercy, any kinds of, I guess, I don't know what you call it, generosity and caring. So that's the